Hi, everyone. My name is Braden Witt. I am the new programs manager at Tree Trust, and I'm going to be giving you my capstone presentation that I did for my master's at the University of Toronto in forest conservation. So my topic today is going to be on what is the value of street trees as an urban asset. So we're going to go over a brief overview of some of the topics that kind of feed into my project, one being asset management. So this is basically the process that a municipality will undergo to understand its built infrastructure. So asset management planning was made mandatory by the province of Ontario, and this is because the province saw an overall decline in asset condition. So they wanted the municipalities to take a few tasks upon themselves to make sure that this wasn't occurring on such a regular basis. For one, they wanted them to conduct an inventory of all their assets that they had. They wanted to understand the level of service provision that they're providing the community, and also, they wanted to have a financial plan in place to understand, or a financial plan to understand the associated costs with this infrastructure. So moving on to natural asset management. So this is quite similar in a way, but it's actually incorporating things in the natural world. So things like complex ecosystems and also living organisms such as trees into that previously mentioned asset portfolio. So we're starting to see the emergence of street trees being incorporated into asset management planning. And out of this sparked the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. So natural asset management first kind of came about in the town of Gibsons, British Columbia. And this was to help preserve a local aquifer that provides a lot of their water purification services. So, along with the town of Gibsons and the David Suzuki Foundation, we get the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. So, this is a program or initiative that has been founded to try and push the agenda of including natural asset management into municipalities across Canada because the town of Gibson saw immense benefits in this process. So to date, there have been two cohorts that have completed this process. Um, and there's also a third cohort that's currently undergoing the phases of initiating this into their asset management portfolios. And the last thing is iTree Eco. So iTree Eco is a tool that was formulated that was constructed in the United States, and this basically helps decision makers put an economic value on street trees to incorporate into their asset management planning. So we've seen a big uptake in this program because of natural asset management. So you might be wondering, what are the differences between asset management and natural asset management? So what traditional assets, they often have a linear rate of maturation because we're dealing with things such as roads and sewers that have well-studied rates of deterioration for their materials, things that like such as concrete and steel. We understand how they're going to degrade over time. We also understand that applying a conditional rating to them is quite easy to quantify, and that's because we're usually starting at the ideal condition after the construction phase commences. So once everything is built, we basically know that that's ideal condition as long as everything's operating properly. We also have a narrow scale of impact when comparing it to natural asset management. Um, some larger projects can have broader considerations, but relatively speaking, it's quite easy to understand the cascading impacts from a built infrastructure or a traditional asset. Looking over to the right, you can see natural asset management. We have a nonlinear or almost randomized rate of maturation. And this is because we're dealing with such high complexity and also living organisms. So they're greatly impacted by things such as climate and weather, pests and pathogens, especially when we're looking at street trees. We also have deterioration is difficult to quantify, and this is because um, we're again dealing with living organisms, and often, in most cases, a street tree is actually going to appreciate in value over time. We also have conditional ratings that are difficult to apply to these types of assets, and that's because we're not always starting at an optimal condition. Street trees can fluctuate in terms of health and service provision throughout their life, So it's very difficult to set an ideal condition rating. We also have broad considerations to take into account, and sometimes we're not always cognizant of the implications, especially when dealing with ecosystems. And lastly, we have these two different types of assets, and often they're at odds, especially in the case of street trees and the urban environment or infrastructure. Oftentimes, built infrastructure gets in the way of trees in terms of their rooting volume, and built infrastructure is impacted by trees, such as power lines and also concrete can be uplifted. So there's numerous impacts to consider between the two. So what are my objectives during this project? So for one, I wanted to see if evaluation models such as iTreeEco provide an effective strategy for natural asset management and the justification for tree preservation programs. Number two, I wanted to see what values associated with street trees are missing in the current natural asset management process and in the iTreeEco model, and how this would change a street tree's value as an asset. And lastly, I wanted to see, are there other methods of valuing street trees that avoid the monetization of nature, and that Western mindset of viewing nature through economics to be of any significance. So to do so, I used a case study from my internship, which was with the town of the Blue Mountains. So this offers a great case study because the town of Blue Mountains is that third cohort that is going through the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. So they're trying to incorporate their street trees into their asset portfolio. Um, so for this, I conducted a street tree inventory over the summer. It wasn't a complete inventory by any means because it's such a large area to work on. But we did get a fair number of trees inventoried, and I used that to input it into the iTree Eco model. It is also worth noting that the town of the Blue Mountains is the second fastest growing municipality in Canada. So there's a high rate of growth here, which is important when you're looking at the future of the urban canopy and all those considerations that must be factored in when managing it as an asset. So results. So out of the almost 900 trees that were inputted into iTreeEco, we got a really strong replacement value for those 900, almost 900 trees, around $7.05 million Canadian. So quite a high value in terms of replacement. One of the biggest environmental services is carbon storage, valued at $132,000 Canadian. And we can see here by looking at these charts that sugar maple are providing a bulk of those services. For one, they have the highest importance value, which you can see in that chart on the lower right. And the importance value is basically how much a certain individual species provides in terms of service provision. And you can see sugar maple by far outcompetes any other. And that's based on a few factors, one being its abundance, and two, also they're the largest diameter class trees. You can see that graph in the top right-hand corner. You can see that sugar maple, that dark green bulge moving throughout the chart is those large sugar maple trees, which there's not many other species that can compare in terms of size class. The only other two could be black walnut, which have fairly large diameter classes, and also some ash species, but ash are, unfortunately, a lot of them are standing dead trees, so they don't really contribute much in terms of services. Okay, in terms of going into more results, we because of this immense benefit we're getting from sugar maple in the town of the Blue Mountains, I wanted to see how this would be forecasted over the next 30 years. So I ran a mortality forecast using the iTreeEco program, and I set the mortality rate to 3%, which is pretty standard for iTreeEco. And this takes into account no planting effort, but keep in mind it is difficult for planting efforts to kind of be noticeable over a 30-year period because we're talking about a pretty short period of time for trees to get established, especially when we're looking at the age and size of the sugar maple we're talking about. So when you do that, you can see that there's a rapid reduction of sugar maple over the next 30 years in terms of this forecast. So around an 83% drop from 217 to just 35 trees. So this could be a modest prediction, especially given the fact that sugar maple are a vulnerable species in urban environments, and also climate change isn't helping that situation in terms of extreme weather events, the number of uh, really hot days that would put a huge stress on these sugar maple. And along with that decline, we see immense uh, decreases and also their services that they're providing the community. So we can see 80% decreases pretty much across the board in terms of carbon stored, yearly carbon sequestration, and also avoided runoff. I also thought it would be cool to kind of give some examples of the individual tree values. So especially if we're looking at these trees at different scales, we have to keep in mind what decision makers are going to be looking at. So for one, I have this large mature sugar maple with a diameter, a DBH at 94 centimeters, a height around 23 meters, and it has a fairly high replacement value, around $22,000. So that's quite a substantial amount, and that would probably enhance its protection. However, when you look at annual benefits per year, it's only around $6.11. So this is a quite minuscule amount, especially given that this is one of the largest trees on the street, and it's irreplaceable in terms of that $22,000 could go to providing new plantings throughout the community, but who knows what the survivor rate would be of those. And also, it takes so long for a tree to get to this stature, especially in an urban environment. Looking at another great example for an individual tree value is this butternut. Has a diameter at breast height around 91 centimeters, height around 23 meters, and it has also a pretty high replacement value around $14,000, nearing pretty close to $15,000. And it also, though, has a very low annual benefits per year valuation, so around $10.90. And when you take into account the significance of the butternut in Ontario because they are an endangered species, you would think that this would be evaluated at a much higher rate than it currently is. So this just highlights a bit of the downsides of using iTree Eco and also keeps in the forefront of our minds that we have to be aware of what scale we're looking at this, especially when decision makers come to the table and they provide these values. We have to understand the overall scale and also the impact that they're having. So what are the main takeaways from this case study? So for one, in the town of Blue Mountains, we can see that sugar maples provide the bulk of the services. They also have a high level of vulnerability going forward, as we saw that the number of trees will drop substantially over a 30-year period. And they also have a high replacement value. Well, trees in general have the high replacement values, but low annual tree value. So we have to be in mind when we're making decisions that we're focusing on this replacement value and also trying to find ways to maybe beef up that annual tree value. And also, sugar maple mortality will leave a gap in this urban canopy. So we have to take that into account for managing this as an asset, the urban forest. We have to look forward to see how we're going to maintain its value or increase its value. So this brings me to the next segment of my project. So what values are missing? So here I provided 3 photos of some trees from the town of the Blue Mountains. And this kind of just shows you where they are in their spatial context. So for one, we have a tree in a busy or a relatively busy shopping center within the town. We have a street tree in front of a school and also one in a local cemetery. So these trees are planted there for a certain purpose, and that's mainly because humans are naturally drawn to green spaces, and we like having these trees as part of our community. So what are these additional values I'm talking about? So they have a broad range of impact on our day-to-day lives, and especially in terms of social benefits. So for one, a child's development can be benefited by having close access to green space, and this includes things like trees. Trees offer affordances for children and help them create better connections to each other and also the landscape. Tree initiatives can also help reduce loneliness and lead to more positive perceptions of one's environment. Looking over to health benefits, It's been found that access to green space and also visibility of certain green spaces and also things like trees um, reduce reduce the progression and also the intensity of neurodegenerative disease and also major depressive disorder. Trees also are great at helping combat the stressors of the urban environment, which is critical when all of our urban centers within Ontario are experiencing um, fairly significant growth rates. It might be not as significant for some, but especially in the town of the Blue Mountains. It's an example where the growth rate's quite significant, and we have to make sure we're planning our city, factoring in each other's health and well-being. And lastly, there are a lot of biological values of trees that can't be captured right now in the iTree Eco model. iTree Eco is fairly anthropocentric, and we have to keep in mind those biocentric values of urban street trees, things such as food provision for certain wildlife, and also usually healthy trees. A human perception of a healthy tree isn't always healthy for an ecosystem because decaying trees offer certain habitat for different species. And also, we have to take into mind that trees provide corridors or connectivity across landscapes. So we could also look into that if we wanted to add additional tree value. So what are other evaluation methods that we could take going forward? So I think a critical one is an indigenous worldview, or doing a two-eyed seeing approach in urban forestry would be highly beneficial. Because when we do these ecosystem service calculations, we often forget or negate the social ecological system that we're creating. We have to keep in mind the articulation, the distribution of those services, and also the generational impact this leaves upon the landscape. So a two-eyed seeing approach is basically weaving between both Western and Indigenous knowledge, but also respecting those two as two separate knowledge bases. So a way forward be to incorporate Indigenous leadership into urban forestry management. Additionally, community-generated values could also be highly beneficial for tree value. So uncovering what values community members hold for individual trees could also bolster a positive impact for tree preservation. So this was actually, there was an initiative out of the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia that did a Text a Tree initiative. So out of that, they found these intrinsic values that include things like place, space, peace, all these intrinsic values that people attach to individual trees. So these community members were, in a way, communicating to a tree and sharing their respect or what they admire about that individual tree. So it's quite a cool initiative that kind of shows that we can't always quantify everything about a tree and its value. So where does that leave us for going forward? So for one, community engagement has to be at the forefront of urban forestry because we're creating landscapes that are deeply rooted in the people who live there. We have to keep in mind what they want to get out of it, what they want from their urban forest. We also have to look at multi-evaluation methods or approaches. So it's not enough just to say that iTree Eco is the be-all and end-all solution. It is a good tool, but we have to keep in mind that there are other ways of looking at urban trees. And also, lastly, we have to ensure that street tree values are reflective of the community in which they're operating in, which is critical because these trees and their spatial context is highly important. So I would like to acknowledge some people that have been highly influential and helpful along this path of doing my capstone presentation. For one, I would like to thank everyone at the Town of the Blue Mountains, especially Sean Carey, Nicholas, and Jeffrey. They were a great resource this past summer. I would also like to thank my supervisors, Sally and Daniela from the University of Toronto. I would special thanks out to Tree Trust, Betty Muse and Tony Ellis, and also Tobias, and any volunteers who came out and participated in this great opportunity. And I'm really excited to be working at Tree Trust now. And I think that this is a topic that Tree Trust is going to try to address in the coming months, is to try and better understand how we actually place a value on a tree, and how that can actually be used to benefit tree preservation in all the communities that we serve. And hopefully, we'll be expanding beyond the 7 chapters and having a wider audience to also get involved in tree preservation. So I'd like to thank everyone for viewing my presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.